you know the way the military looks at the world, they divide things into the tactical, the operational, and the strategic. If you understand the business model of how terrorists operate, then there are opportunities to target and take out those individuals, so you don't have to capture and kill everybody. There is no way to kill your way to victory in the war against global violent extremism.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Miller Center Forum. Today we're thrilled to welcome Thom Shanker and Eric Schmitt, two of the nation's most accomplished journalists covering national security and military affairs, and the authors of Counterstrike, the untold story of America's secret campaign against Al-Qaeda. Both of them spent roughly the last year as senior writers in residence at the Center for New American Security. Thom Shanker joined the New York Times in 1997 as assistant Washington editor and is currently a correspondent covering the Pentagon and national security, including efforts at transformation within the Pentagon and the global campaign against terrorism. Prior to joining the Times, Mr. Shanker was a foreign editor of the Chicago Tribune, spending extensive time based in Berlin and also as Moscow bureau chief. Eric Schmitt is a senior writer for the New York Times who has written about the military and national security affairs for the newspaper for more than 20 years. Mr. Schmitt has covered some of the biggest stories and was part of two teams of Times reporters awarded the Pulitzer Prize, including one in 1999 for coverage of the transfer of sensitive military technology to China, and another in 2009 for coverage of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Since the September 11th attacks, both have made numerous trips to Iraq and Afghanistan, embedding with troops at various levels to cover American military operations there. Please welcome Thom Shanker and Eric Schmitt.
Well, thank you, Christina, for that warm introduction, and thank you all for coming out here on a drizzly Monday morning. My teenage daughter in Fairfax wishes she were here too. She's hoping to be a part of your community in the next couple of years, for 4 more years. What I thought I'd do is start out, Thom and I are going to kind of do a tag team up here, is the way we've been doing this, is to kind of describe a little bit about what we've been doing the last couple of years and how this book came to be written and why we think it's so important, and talking about how the campaign against terrorism that this administration and the previous one in the Bush administration, how this all came to be. And as we looked about it, it was really about 3 years ago when Thom and I first started looking at this question as we were researching an article on how counterterrorism strategies and operations had changed. And many of our sources said to understand where we are today, you really have to understand where the country was on 9/11, to understand how far it's come and how far it still has to go in terms of changes. And there were 2 things that we focused on early in our reporting. One was on 9/11, just how little the United States government really knew about Al-Qaeda and about terrorist networks. And to give an understanding of this and really understand a little bit about how little it was known, as we went around and we talked to individuals in the Bush White House who were there that day and were in the White House and in Washington, and it became clear on 9/11 that it was Al-Qaeda was the organization that was responsible for carrying out the attack. There were actually people inside the White House who asked, Al who? When it came to understanding who this organization was. It just wasn't on the radar. Al-Qaeda as an organization wasn't well understood, even though, of course, it had already carried out one attack against the World Trade Center towers in New York in 1993, and it carried out an attack against the USS Cole in Aden Harbor in Yemen. But terrorism was something that happened overseas. It didn't happen to people in the United States, aside from, of course, the tragedy in Oklahoma City. The other major flaw as we looked into our reporting was the response to 9/11 that the government undertook. And perhaps understandably that response, it was an instinctive one, was to use the military might of the United States along with its intelligence community and basically use the approach to try and kill and capture its way to victory. I mean, the idea, after all, was if we just kill enough of these fighters and kill and capture enough of its leaders, that this organization will collapse internally and we'll be done with it. That was pretty much the thinking, even after the successful efforts in Afghanistan with a small number of special forces troops going in and working with the Northern Alliance to move out al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan and take down the Taliban government. But that really was the theory. That was the philosophy. That was the thinking at the time. And it was only a couple years into this whole campaign when there's an important pivotal moment, as we write in our book. And this comes in December of 2003. And this is when Secretary of Don Rumsfeld pens a very important memo to about half a dozen of his top civilian and military leaders. Now, at this point, we always have to caution our editors that just because Don Rumsfeld said it doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong. In fact, Rumsfeld puts his finger on it in this important memo. It's a very short memo, but he raises this important question. And the question is this: are we, with our operations now, and again, this is December of 2003 in Iraq, are we creating more militants than we are taking off the battlefield? And if we are, we have to look at this whole campaign against a new enemy in a different way. And again, Rumsfeld, for all of his flaws, had a vision here. When he had a problem and it wasn't being addressed, you expand the problem. And that is essentially what he did. He's asking, starting with his top military advisors, to do this, but soon it's expanding throughout the government. And this is really one of the first times where the government is starting to look out from that kill and capture mentality. And so what we do in the book is look at this evolution over 10 years, where the government goes from knowing very little about al-Qaeda and terrorist organizations in general to where we stand today, with a pretty detailed knowledge of its leadership, of its structure, how it works, certainly since the death of bin Laden and the information that was taken out of his safe house in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Much is known. It's still imperfect, though. It's still imperfect knowledge, the understanding of how terrorist networks operate and how they tend to bleed together now in many of the areas that the U.S. is combating forces today. We also look at how this campaign goes from being a fairly straightforward military campaign with the assistance of the U.S. intelligence agencies to what we call a much more whole-of-government approach, where spies and soldiers are still very important, obviously, as the raid on Abbottabad in May that killed bin Laden indicates. But by now, here we are 10 years later, this is a much more whole-of-government, meaning other agencies of the U.S. government are much more involved. The State Department, its diplomats are much more involved in counterterrorism efforts. The Justice Department and the FBI have people who are deployed overseas and are working alongside their foreign counterparts. The Treasury Department, of all things, is the lead agency of the U.S. government in trying to choke off the financing that terrorists use, and have analysts sitting side by side in places like Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, trying to work on cutting back and eliminating wealthy donors in that country who continue to give money to the Taliban and to al-Qaeda. So as we look forward in terms of how this approach is going, we're wrestling with those two big questions, because this is all still very much an evolving picture. How is the threat changing, and how is the response this government makes? So how did this all happen? I'm going to turn it over to Thom to tell you the next part of the story.
I'd like to echo very sincere thanks to the Miller Center and to Christina for inviting us here today, and for all of you taking time out of your schedule to let us come and to discuss this with you. I like to say that everything important I know in life I've learned from my wife, Johnny Cash, and the United States Army. And the Army in particular is important because as Eric and I were casting our eyes back over the past 10 years, we were looking for some organizing principles to gather all of this information in a way that would be digestible. And if you know the way the military looks at the world, they divide things into the tactical and the operational and the strategic. And so we do just that in our book. We have some tactical case studies, the young men and women learning, evolving, doing missions on the ground. We have some very cool, very exclusive stories that had never been reported before, and I'll share one of those with you later. And then at the operational level, we analyze how the bureaucracies and the institutions of our government evolved and how they came to a greater understanding that terrorists operate in networks. They even have corporate structures, if you will. And if you understand the business model of how terrorists operate, what individual nodes are essential to the entire enterprise, then there are opportunities to target and take out those individual financiers, bomb makers, gun runners, etc., So you don't have to capture and kill everybody, because there is no way to kill your way to victory in the war against global violent extremism. And what the government learned is that it takes a network to defeat a network. And then, of course, at the high level, at the uber level, at the meta level, we describe the search for a grand strategy of counterterrorism, something that would echo containment and deterrence that existed during the Cold War and kept a tense nuclear peace with the Soviet Union during all those dark days. So I'd like to focus on first is that strategic search for a grand strategy of counterterrorism. And it's an untold story of how a very unlikely group of big thinkers inside the Pentagon, across the intelligence community, and in some of the military commands were thinking outside the box. And the two most important were an old Cold Warrior at the Pentagon and his young Jedi apprentice, who's sort of a Hollywood handsome CIA intern. And I mentioned Hollywood handsome. If anyone's looking for the screen rights, Eric and I will be available afterwards. The problems are obvious, though, when you try and apply containment and deterrence to a terror network. Obviously, terrorists don't hold territory like the Soviet Union did. So there's no way to identify very valuable targets to hold at risk, like the Kremlin, like factories, like the Soviet Union's own missile silos, like the dachas on the Black Sea where the Politburo kept their Bolshoi ballerina mistresses. I mean, really valuable things that you can hold at risk. And at the same time, of course, terrorists do not leave a return address like an incoming missile from the Soviet Union does. So those were the problems. But what these new thinkers sought to do was to identify a different kind of territory that these violent extremists hold dear, a virtual territory that is required for them to operate effectively. And if you can put those things at risk, if you make the terrorists worry about the safety of those virtual safe havens, then you can affect their thinking and change their behavior, and that, of course, is the essence of classic deterrence. So what are these things? Chances for success, personal glory and reputation. So if you throw up barriers and make it harder, then a lot of terrorists would rather not try than try and fail and be disgraced in the eyes of their followers. Terrorists, believe it or not, want support among the Muslim community. It's where they get their money, it's where they get their volunteers. So slowly the government learned that it should point out that 85% of those killed in terrorist attacks since 9/11 have been innocent Muslims. Terrorists also require network cohesion, trust, confidence. So the government and the intelligence community tried to understand how to get inside the terrorist communication systems and how they think, and therefore to sow confusion and distrust and dissent, to take apart the cohesion from the inside. Now, we acknowledge that this assessment of a new deterrence against violent extremism is not perfect. It certainly won't work on someone like a bin Laden or those at the highest level, and it also won't work on those young, committed jihadis after they've strapped on a suicide vest. It's simply too late. But there are a lot of people in the middle who are required for a terrorist system to operate who don't want to make the ultimate sacrifice. And you can threaten them and put them at risk to achieve a deterrent effect. And this concept also borrows from an older thinking on deterrence, which goes back to traditional criminal justice. You put cops on the street, you put bars on the window, you build prisons with unbreakable walls, all to influence the decisions of those who are intending criminal action and hope to deter that. Well, as exciting and and with all the potential that this thinking on new deterrence offered, there were a lot of people who resisted. And I guess the number one resistor in chief was President George Bush. He wanted to be a war on terror president, not a deterring terror president. So when Rumsfeld took these new ideas down to his ranch at Crawford, Texas in 2005, Bush said, "No, I'm sorry, I'm not buying it. It doesn't work." But as fate would have it, inside that closed room down at the ranch in Crawford, there was a 4-star general sitting there, General James Cartwright, who at the time was commander of America's Strategic Command, which owns the classic crown jewels of America's nuclear arsenal, the bombers, the missiles, the nuclear submarines. And Cartwright on his own, a brilliant thinker and analyst, had been working through some of these same issues. And President Bush turned to General Cartwright and said, Haas, what do you think about this nonsense that my defense secretary is talking? And Cartwright said, well, with all due respect, Mr. President, we're doing the same work, and there's a lot to be had there. Cartwright was in the room that day, not to talk about this thinking, but to talk about missile defense against North Korea and Iran. And what Cartwright said to the president, who was a huge supporter of limited missile defense, he said, Mr. President, if you think that 12 or 20 or 30 of our missile interceptors, which we know will be unable to knock down every enemy missile, but if you believe that small system can inject uncertainty into the mind of an adversary in North Korea or Iran, if you think our limited, imperfect system might change the thinking of North Korea or Iran, if you accept that deterrent, well, Mr. President, how can you not apply those same rules and thinking to countering violent extremism?
So this deterrence idea sounds good, but how do you carry it out in the field? How do you carry it out in practice? This is what some of the critics in the Pentagon and other people were saying. How do you make this work? Well, let me give you a few examples from our book on how you make this work. And again, a lot of these things are happening in the field as we write in this book. Many of these things, the innovations are coming from the young military officials, officers, young analysts, people who are trying to solve problems on the ground, not being directed necessarily from Washington or their higher headquarters in some place. So let's take this example of thinking about deterrence and networks, as Thom had mentioned before. This idea of networks is really important because, again, the idea that you can have on the one end of the spectrum suicide bombers, probably most of them are not deterrable. They think they're going to get their just rewards carrying out their attacks, probably not much going after them. Bin Laden himself, again, probably not going to get to him, although the government tried, as we write about, to make secret efforts right after the 9/11 attacks to get to him through his family with secret messages. He never responded. But the people in the middle that Thom talked about, these enablers, these supporters, these are the people like the logisticians, the gun runners, the financiers. These are these people within the network, the bombers, they rely upon. But they're also people who are not driven by the ideology. They're in it for the money largely. And so if you can target them and say, we are going to take you out of this business for some reason, you are going to be able to take that important piece of the chain out of place and make it much more difficult for the bombers to carry out their task. So again, how does this actually happen in the field? Well, one instance we talk about is the instance of the suicide bomber networks that evolved where young suicide bombers are recruited from all throughout the Mideast, North Africa. They come into Syria, and there's a pipeline that comes in through Syria and into Iraq. And initially, the attempt were to just try and pick off these suicide bombers as they come in through Iraq and kill off as many as you can before they can get their suicide vests. But they found that there was just almost a limitless supply of these young men who were committed to jihad and committed to blowing themselves up. So some of the intelligence analysts getting together, and this is talking with some of their Iraqi colleagues as well, started saying, well, you know what? If we take out a very important piece of this network, we'll do better, I think. And the key here is each one of these suicide bombers had to have his mission blessed by a cleric, a Sharia emir, who's going to bless this attack going forward, therefore ensuring the bomber knows that he'll go to heaven and get all the benefits, the virgins and everything that come along with this package deal. What happens, though, these analysts ask themselves, if you can take out that emir, if instead of killing and capturing the bombers themselves, you take out that key person who's blessing the attacks. And so what they did was they started killing and capturing some of these emirs. And guess what? It's a lot harder to replace a trained Sharia emir than it is some suicide bomber. And without that guy to bless the attacks, the bombers aren't going to go forward. So their effort is stymied in this part of Iraq for several weeks, even months, until they can reorganize themselves. But again, it's an example of where the military, working with analysts, started pulling a very important piece out of this network to disrupt or dissuade these attacks from taking place. Another example is, again, going after the financiers. And we talk about in our book how, in the case of Nangarhar province in Afghanistan, the American military, working with analysts, again on the ground, go after this ancient money trading system called hawalas. These are family-run businesses, basically. And what the Americans did was they shut down about half a dozen of these businesses. And then they turned to their colleagues in the community and said, you saw what we just did? We shut down your neighbors and your colleagues. These are good businesses you have. They provide you a nice standard of living. You've got a nice house. There's a nice garden that goes with this house. There's nice wherewithal for your children and all. We will make this go away, however. We will shut you down just as we shut down your neighbors if you continue to do business with the Taliban. It's fine to do legitimate business. Go ahead with that. But keep doing business with the Taliban, you'll end up like your neighbors, out of luck. Within a matter of weeks, the amount of business transactions the Taliban were able to conduct in Nangarhar province dropped dramatically, and they had to move elsewhere to conduct their business. Again, forcing them to make it more difficult to operate. Again, without firing a shot here. And finally, what we talk about in our book in a great amount of detail is how the United States has been able to penetrate perhaps the ultimate safe haven that terrorists have, and that is the internet, the cyber world. This is where the terrorists do much of their recruiting, where they raise money, or even through the use of virtual online war games, they can actually plot and carry out attacks using the same vernacular that your teenager might use in using these type of war games. The other thing that Americans are doing now is they're infiltrating many of these militant chat rooms, getting inside, oftentimes doing no more than posing very provocative questions, posing as militants and saying, dear brothers, why is it that this bombing of a wedding party in Amman, Jordan, that killed scores of Muslim men, women, and children, civilians, how does this advance our goal? How does this advance the goal of Osama bin Laden? Again, raises questions and doubts, maybe dissuade some of these young militants who are thinking of carrying out bombings or attacks from deciding whether they really want to go through or not. Same thing is happening as the Americans are penetrating, infiltrating, hacking into the cell phone networks of terrorist leaders so that they can send out contradictory or confusing messages to the militants themselves, to the point where militants are reading these messages on their cell phones and going, you know, I think our guy has lost it upstairs. He's sending out messages. I don't think I necessarily want to go along with the program anymore on this one. And finally, where the cyber defenses of the United States have been able to come up with exact duplicates of the watermarks that al-Qaeda uses to put out their messages. Again, being able to send out contradictory messages in terms of confusing and perhaps dissuading militants from starting these attacks together. So even as the tactical successes on the ground are growing, as you start understanding intelligence better and looking how to combat enemy, there also this understanding, as we talked earlier in the talk, about how to understand your enemy, how to get inside their head, how to dissuade and disrupt them in different ways. This is really the long-term solution to this campaign.
So I'd like to share with you one of the case studies from our book. It's an example of how after the early, if understandable, fumbling and stumbling after 9/11, when the U.S. focused exclusively on capture and kill, how after a number of years, the interagency did learn to work together. It's a case of, what right really can look like when our government gets its act together. It starts on another September 11th, this time in 2007, and it was a mission in the western deserts of Iraq. It's just a dusty tent village called Sinjar that American intelligence had found was the most significant smuggling route for foreign fighters and jihadis coming in from outside of Iraq. It's a modest historic footnote, but Iraqi insurgents really were not suicide bombers. They didn't want to die for the cause. They wanted to live another day. So most of the suicide bombers were foreign jihadis who came to attack the Americans, and if not to be suicide bombers themselves, to learn fighting techniques and bomb-making skills. And as you all will recall, 2007, during the surge, the suicide bombings were 40, 50, 60 a day, exacting a terrible toll, not only on the American and allies, but of course on the Iraqi people. So the U.S. government had put just a number of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms overhead of this town of Sinjar. They had sucked up cell phones, they had 24/7 real-time video, and they established what they call a pattern of life. And they could predict when each shipment of future suicide bombers would be coming in. So a commando team went in, and they went in hard. They killed the emir who managed the smuggling line. They killed several of his comrades. But what they didn't expect, and which was the real bonus, they scooped up a number of computers and hard drives and documents. And what they learned, according to our sources, was that Al-Qaeda is as anal as the Nazis when it comes to record keeping. Another interesting observation was in video cameras. Al-Qaeda videoed everything as much as Pamela Anderson and Tommy Lee, according to one of our sources. So what they were able to cull from this incredible trove of data became known as the Al-Qaeda Rolodex. They had ID documents, aliases, hometowns of all the young men who had come to Iraq to make jihad. More importantly, it showed which school teachers or religious leaders had inspired them to make jihad. And they were able to determine in graphic spreadsheet form where they were from and where the ink spots or the centers of gravity that were providing so many suicide bombers. 2/3 were coming from Libya and Saudi Arabia. Very, very interesting. One an ally, one not one at the time. All the documents were translated and compiled and analyzed, but the military wondered, what can we do with them? This is a very powerful narrative. Well, in the military, whatever unit captures intelligence owns the classification of that intelligence. So an officer who wasn't very well known at the time, but is now, his name is Stanley McChrystal. He was the commander of this mission, and he decided, I'm going to break down walls. This is simply too valuable to keep inside my Joint Special Operations Command to run more missions. We need to push this out to the world. So he declassified more than 800 files on 800 jihadis. He gave it to Special Operations Command to collate. He gave it to West Point to do some academic research. And then the most really revolutionary idea, he gave it to the State Department, where the new ambassador for counterterrorism was an old battle buddy of his, a retired 3-star general named Del Daley, who had become the State Department's top officer for counterterrorism. So General Daley / Ambassador Daley went across the Middle East to countries that were friends of the U.S., to countries that were partners of the U.S., and even countries with whom we had very, very rocky relations. And he would walk in with his general's credentials, but in his ambassador suit, and lay out for the Interior Ministry, justice officials, their intelligence officers, all of this data. He said, look, guys, this is not American propaganda. These are your passports. These are your identity papers. These are your internal travel documents that show that these jihadis are coming from your country. And even if you don't care about the fate of our soldiers or the Iraqis, a number of these are going to come back to your country very highly trained. Do you want that? You have to help us stop the flow of these young men out of your country. General Daley's efforts were so effective that by the end of 2007 and into 2008, General Petraeus, who was the overall commander in Iraq, said that this whole of government effort, beginning with the intelligence on the Sinjar site, the commando raid, the capture of the documents, the exploitation of the intelligence, and then the diplomatic effort to spread it across the Middle East, that entire whole of government effort did more to halt suicide bombing in Iraq than any military mission could have.
So to conclude, where does all this leave us today? Here we are, just a couple weeks after the 10th anniversary of 9/11. There are a lot of commemoration ceremonies at Ground Zero in Washington and Shanksville. But where is the country today as we kind of complete the arc of our book? Well, to be sure, the al-Qaeda leadership in Pakistan with the death of bin Laden in May, in that Navy SEAL raid, has taken some severe blows. There have been several other key al-Qaeda leaders that have been taken off the battlefield in just that period of time, through drone strikes, through capture. And so that important al-Qaeda leadership structure in the tribal areas along the Afghan border is diminished now. Its capability to organize and carry out attacks against the United States is diminished. Not completely eliminated, but diminished. At the same time, however, there's been a growth of affiliates of al-Qaeda. Corporate offshoots, think of them that way, how franchises, in places like North Africa, in East Africa, in Somalia, and most troublesome in Yemen. Yemen, after all, is the al-Qaeda offshoot that orchestrated the so-called underpants bomber, the young Nigerian man who tried to blow himself up on a plane over Detroit in Christmas of 2009. Or the same organization that 10 months later packed explosives in printer cartridges, put them on air cargo planes bound for Chicago, and but for a tip from the Saudi intelligence service, could well have exploded somewhere along the lines. So you have a diminished threat from the leadership that orchestrated and carried out the attack against 9/11, which suggests that the possibility of another large-scale mass casualty attack like what we witnessed and experienced on 9/11 is probably less than what we have today. But the likelihood of another attack, a smaller scale attack, is probably greater, coming not only from these affiliates that continue to scheme and come up with plots to do this, but also from Americans here in the United States who are radicalized in a couple of ways, either by traveling to the tribal areas and being trained by al-Qaeda instructors on the use of bomb-making techniques, such as a young man named Najibullah Zazi, who was a Manhattan pushcart vendor and later a Denver airport driver who had a plot to basically carry backpack bombs onto the subway system in New York and blow them up during rush hour. Again, luckily this plot was thwarted. But it also involves Americans who are being radicalized in their homes, in onesies and twosies, by listening to the online videos of, particularly in the case of a guy named Anwar al-Awlaki. He was an American-born cleric. He preached in mosques just up in Fairfax, Virginia, and in San Diego. And he's now in hiding in Yemen, where he's not only that affiliate's chief propagandist, but he's also one of their chief operational planners right now, knowing and understanding the ways of the West and the ways specifically of the United States in trying to come up with new attacks against that way. So where does this leave us in terms of a response? Well, clearly the government is marshaled much more of its response at the cost of hundreds of millions and billions of dollars, really. And I think we're going now through an exercise in Washington of reconciling the costs as the economy sinks in, the troubles of the economy sink in, and trying to measure and assign some risks. Can this country now take more risks now that we're more mature and think more maturely about the threat that we face? Understanding that if you look at the 9/11 attacks, of course, that day there were 4 airplanes hijacked, 3, of course, 2 driven into the World Trade Center towers, 1 into the Pentagon. And yet, what was the threat that people were worried about on 9/11 itself on the 10th anniversary? It was the concern that a couple of possible U.S. citizens had gotten back into the country and were going to carry out a truck bomb in either Washington or New York. So the scale is quite different. Still, the aim is to terrorize. What we argue in our book, however, is that this country's leadership, starting with the president, on its way down through the Congress, has not prepared the American public for what we say will be, and we believe will be, another attack. We don't know exactly when it's going to come or what form it will be. If you look at the creativity of these bomb makers out there now, it could come in the form of another airplane strike. It could come in just about any way. It could come in just the radicalization of an individual, as we saw at Fort Hood, Texas, where an Army major picked up an automatic rifle and shot some of his colleagues right there in a processing center. It could come like that any day. But what this country has not done, and its country's political leaders have not done, is to start talking about how that next attack will come and to how the country needs to be more resilient to defend against that. And I don't mean, and we don't mean in our book, to say resilience in the form of rebuilding, physically rebuilding. I think all of us who saw the images from Ground Zero have to be heartened by what we saw and what's actually being rebuilt there in Lower Manhattan. But what we're talking about in our book is psychological resilience. The same kind of resilience that the Brits and the Israelis have, for instance, and have unfortunately learned through many years of hard experience in dealing with terrorists in those countries. And learning that after an attack, you physically clean up the attack, you grieve those who have died, but then you move on. So you don't overreact and you don't give the terrorists exactly what they want, that overreaction that will continue their momentum to recruit anew. So as we look forward to the coming years, as this government tries to get its arms around this attack, again, are we safer? I think we're safer probably from the same kind of mass casualty attack that we witnessed on 9/11. We're probably more vulnerable to that smaller scale attack. And the question is, when it comes, will this country be resilient enough to deal with it in a mature way, address the problem, and not overreact? That's the question before us today. Thom and I thank you very much again for coming today, and we look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. In a few moments, I will head to the back of the room and invite you all to please line up in the back to ask questions. But I'd like to begin with a point that you touched upon very briefly, Eric, actually. And it's something that I imagine comes as a surprise to most Americans, which is these early U.S. efforts to communicate directly with al-Qaeda and with bin Laden. I was hoping that you could give us some details on this, putting this into context, and to what extent is there reason to believe that perhaps these attempts continue today?
So what we write about in our book are right after the 9/11 attacks, there are a number of reactions. We talk about the kill and capture reaction of troops on the ground. Some of the reactions were frankly somewhat harebrained. I mean, one of the things we write about in the book is how at one point in a small meeting of Pentagon officials, somebody even suggested if there was going to be signs of another attack coming from al-Qaeda, that the United States threatened to bomb Mecca. Well, you can imagine that, again, that kind of shows the lack of cultural sensitivity, to say the very least, about the kind of thinking that went on. Thankfully, that idea never left the room. But what they did do, and what the Americans, a small number of intelligence officials and others in the government did, was they tried to open a conversation with bin Laden himself, ostensibly to try and set down some red lines, to say, look, we understand, obviously we've been attacked by al-Qaeda, but here are we going to draw some red lines around which we will take actions that maybe you not have even conceived. They did this through going through bin Laden family members and business associates in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the Middle East in the hopes of at least trying to draw out an adversary, just as the United States, against thinking as kind of these loose lines of deterrence, had sought out different Soviet leaders throughout the years. But as these efforts went on for a number of years, and again, very small group, very hush-hush, the response from bin Laden was silence. And as far as we know today, there's been no response.
Thank you for coming. It's a fascinating story. It sounds to me as if what you are describing represents the victory of those who said we better concentrate on counterterrorism rather than counterinsurgency has finally been worked out. That makes sense to me. And I think the point that you were making about developing American resiliency, I like the statement by Michael Leiter as he was leaving the NCTC that people had to be ready for this. But my question goes to the so-called Arab Spring countries. You mentioned it in the context of Yemen. I'm thinking broadening that to perhaps Libya. We don't know how that's going to work out. Egypt, the same thing. Do our people who are working on this matrix and these people who are fueling terrorist activity, making money out of it, are they beginning to look at the turbulence in the Arab Spring countries as sort of a more fertile field to work in for their ends than Afghanistan might be?
Right. That's an incredibly important question. Thank you for asking. In the early days of the Arab Spring in Tunisia and Egypt, al-Qaeda was caught flat-footed because, in fact, they had always said that it would take violent acts to liberate the Arab world from the despotic regimes, many of whom were allied with the United States. So when, in fact, those governments fell through the efforts of a bottom-up people power revolution, democratic ideals, the al-Qaeda narrative seemed to be dead. What we've learned since, of course, is that was just the first act of what's going to be a three-act play, if not more. And as the hopes and aspirations of the Arab Spring begin to enter, pardon the cliche, a rather grim Arab autumn, in that gap there is certainly opportunity for extremism to come back in and try to gain inroads, and we're seeing that in some places already, yes indeed.
Hello, and thank you both for coming and for laying out so much in such a short time. I might conclude from the introduction that you feel that it was a wrong move to start war against the Taliban in Afghanistan just after 9/11. Is that what you intend?
No, not at all. I mean, I think what we say is obviously there was going to be a natural reaction to go after the perpetrators of an attack that killed nearly 3,000 Americans. I mean, I don't think there's any question about that. And I think we would argue that that was done fairly smartly with a small footprint. I mean, the Americans at the time, the leaders were conscious of the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, so they sent small numbers of CIA and special forces to work with the Northern Alliance to drive out, and obviously using air power, American air power, to drive out al-Qaeda and ultimately to collapse the Taliban government. I think from there, of course, you move into the decision the Bush administration made to go to war with Iraq, which was not a center or a hub for terrorists at the time. It became one, though, as we've talked about in some of the examples in our talk. So I think now we've come full circle, of course, as time went on, and Afghanistan was a neglected campaign. Both the Taliban and al-Qaeda, their al-Qaeda allies, largely across the border in Pakistan, were able to reconstitute, retrain, and take more territory, leaving the government in the United States now in the position where we have the American troops on the ground. Now they're both fighting Taliban and other militant groups, many of whom have safe haven in Pakistan, which is a major problem, both for the effort on the ground there as well as for American foreign policy.
Thank you very much for excellent talks. Could you comment on the role of the broadcast media in helping us develop this resilience that I agree with you we need? I've been thinking about this for some time. And I don't think the broadcast media or the media in general have really lifted a finger along these lines.
Well, I'm sort of an old school journalist. I mean, whenever I'm in Vienna for arms talks, I actually lay flowers at the statue of Gutenberg, because without him I wouldn't have a job. So I'm old school enough so that I don't believe that the broadcast media or any media have a role to further government policy. We are to inform and to educate and to investigate so that all of you, the taxpayers and voters, can tell your government how you want to act. The theme of resiliency, if that's to be communicated to the American people, it has to be done by the senior leadership. An earlier questioner cited Michael Leiter, but it really has to come from the presidential level. And just before 9/11, Eric and I had a scoop in the Times because we were made privy to the White House talking points ahead of the 10th anniversary. And for the first time, resilience was front and center. The way that's a challenge is in the polarized political environment we have today. Whenever a senior leader talks about resilience, well, unpack that. What does that mean? We're going to get attacked again. And that, of course, in this political environment, lets those of the other party, whichever party, to accuse the president of being weak. So I think if there's one thing that, you know, the whole media have to discuss is to hold our leaders accountable for why there is not a more unified view of national policy from the water's edge outward, as there were for many years during the Cold War. Domestic disputes stay at home, foreign policy, the parties come together. So I don't think it's the broadcaster's role. I think it's up to the political leadership.
Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us this morning. I have a three-part question, if you don't mind. One, have you looked into what the root cause is for people to strap on a bomb belt, the suicide bombers? And two, you know, Al-Qaeda was non-existent in Iraq before we attacked in 2003. Any comment on that? And three, now that Osama is gone, shouldn't we not get out of Afghanistan? Thank you.
I'll take a shot at the first couple of those. I mean, in terms of the root causes, of course, it's very difficult because you look at the al-Qaeda leadership, and many of them came from very well-educated, wealthy families. Bin Laden himself, his father is one of the most wealthy construction builders in the Middle East. But certainly, as you can look across the Arab Spring movement, for instance, and see there are some common elements. The alienation of, in this case, many young people, their economic opportunities, their educational opportunities, essentially a poverty of hope that they have any chance of advancing themselves or their family. And I think that's, obviously, these are kind of local grievances that al-Qaeda has preyed upon, and other militant groups as well, in trying to make this not just a local grievance, whether it's in your village or your province or your county, but make it a nationwide and then an international crusade. So I think this is the trouble the United States has had in trying to counter this message. It's in a very effective, but simple but effective message that al-Qaeda continues to espouse, and that is the West and the United States is at war with Islam. And how do you fight that when there are tens of thousands of American troops remaining in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and as we saw last week in the debate for the United Nations General Assembly, the whole issue of Palestinian statehood. This provides much of the grist for this alienation to continue. In terms of al-Qaeda in Iraq, as I alluded to in an earlier question, to be sure, there was not a terrorist threat inside of Iraq in 2002 or 2003. But once, of course, the United States decides to go in, it becomes a magnet, as we talked about with these suicide bombers coming in from all over the Middle East, trying to come in, and it becomes, the center for jihad in that area. Trying to turn that around now has been a great task, as we talk about in our book. Al-Qaeda in Iraq has been largely defeated, but as we see even today, it's starting to make a comeback there. Maybe Thom would like to take on the third one.
He's going to leave me the tough one that's going to get me in trouble. Actually, to answer the third question, should we get out of Afghanistan, it's really worth reviewing Eric's answer on the second. The Bush administration made the case for war in Iraq because of what intelligence said was weapons of mass destruction and indicated potential links to terrorists that might get those for an attack on the U.S. Well, that intelligence has been debunked. The one lesson of Iraq that is undeniable is that no American president is ever going to send 150,000 troops to invade a country on a counterterrorism mission. Just not going to happen. So how is that relevant for Afghanistan? The U.S. troop withdrawal is already set for the end of 2014. That being said, there are vital strategic interests in preventing Afghanistan from becoming yet again a safe haven for al-Qaeda, or allowing any place on the world to be a safe haven where terrorists can look to attack the United States and our allies. So I think what this country is evolving to, in fact, the narrative spine of our entire book, is this new Darwinism. Terrorists are evolving and getting smarter. The U.S. is trying to evolve and get smarter as well. So troops are already slated to come out of Afghanistan by 2014, but no doubt a smaller counterterrorism presence is likely to remain there and also in other parts of the world.
As some of you know, we're beginning to incorporate questions from different social media outlets into our forums. So this is a question that comes from Kyle Kottner in Washington, D.C., submitted via Facebook. How do you think real-time reporting helps or hurts U.S. efforts to combat terrorism?
Well, I think certainly it gives you a bird's eye view as to what's going on, but it can cut two ways. Let's look at the Mumbai attacks, for instance, in India. By having those attacks aired live on not on Indian television, but international television with CNN and other international networks, it obviously gave the general public, as well as world leaders and other counterterrorism officials, a very clear look at what's going on. But what it also did, and this was deliberately done by the terrorists, it gave them situational awareness. By just watching their television coverage, they could see what was succeeding, what was not. And they could, with their handlers back in Pakistan, they could be directed to certain other kinds of attacks just by watching what is working on various floors of some of those hotels and what's going on around the town. I mean, this has raised questions even in the immediate aftermath of Mumbai, whether the media, and particularly television broadcasting, should either boycott or blackout or somehow restrict their coverage of this. This was actually raised by people at New York NYPD, New York City Police Department, who sent a team over to Mumbai to study that, to study what would happen. Could this happen in New York or any other major American city? And could we actually, the police in this case, request the broadcast media to restrict some of its coverage to impair the ability of terrorists to use that to their tactical advantage? It's a discussion that obviously has been going on behind closed doors and probably wouldn't work just because of the need to know for information, but it raises a really interesting point of how you, in this case, would manage, from a law enforcement standpoint, a very fast-moving, fluid terrorist-type attack, a small-scale attack happening in multiple locations simultaneously, how you would defeat that when the terrorists are using part of the communications network that, in this case, Americans have come to rely on for their information.
Thinking about the recent news on the numbers of soldiers who've been injured in Pakistan by the Taliban with their ties to al-Qaeda. Do you think it's a good idea for the United States to remove the financial aid that we've been giving to Pakistan?
Pakistan is probably the most vexing foreign policy issue facing our country today. And yes, that's my line that I can't give you a direct answer. We have vital interests there. I mean, it's a nuclear power sitting on, the crossroads of violent extremism. What we learned, though, in years past, when the U.S. cut off ties completely with Pakistan, is we allowed an entire generation of their military officers not to have the opportunity to come to the United States and study at Leavenworth and interact with our military and create the kinds of ties that really do bind the militaries together. So is there a problem with the relationship? Absolutely. But is severing ties the first step that we should take, cutting off all aid? I'm not sure what the effect of that would be. I mean, to understand Pakistan's point of view, you really have to put yourself where they sit. Whether we agree or not, they look in one direction and see India as their existential threat. They look at the other way at Afghanistan and see a very unstable country where they know the U.S. is going to leave yet again. They've seen this movie before. It's called Charlie Wilson's War. I mean, they've literally seen this movie before. And so they are supporting insurgent extremist groups in Afghanistan because that is how they want to maintain influence there. The problem is, as one of our intelligence sources used to say to us, Pakistan is keeping these poisonous snakes to bite the neighbors' kids, but they will bite their own kids as well. And Pakistan is playing a very, very dangerous game. And it's up to their leadership internally to come to the realization that that's not the best policy.
It strikes me that much of what you studied in the book was secure. It held it was tough to get in there. Can you tell me something about your sources, and did you have any luck with the NSA, which must have played a great part in it?
So our book is largely drawn from first accounts, from interviews that we had with more than 200 individuals throughout the government at the highest levels of the Pentagon, the Justice Department, the FBI, CIA, the other intelligence communities, Justice Department, State Department. Again, trying to get as whole a government approach in our sourcing as we were in our approach to this book. We did receive pretty good cooperation, and I think in large regard that's because Thom and I have been working this story as beat reporters for the Times for 15, 20 years. And so we're going back to many sources who've been working with us for our daily reporting and basically saying, we want to take a step back and trying to put the last 10 years in perspective. Can you help us do that? And through their recollections, through providing us with certain documents, through giving us their real perspective, sometimes many cases, after they've left government, it enables them to perhaps be a little bit more candid than they were before. In terms of the question of classification, particularly in areas such as the cyber stuff. I mean, we were very careful as we discussed this with sources that nothing that we published we think crosses any lines. I mean, all this information we were very careful to go back to our sources and say, look, here's what we're planning to publish. And this is, by the way, what we do with daily newspaper stories is too. This is what we're planning to publish. If you have any objection on grounds of national security, sources and methods, let us know now. If you have an objection, we can work it out, and we did in these cases. And in very small instances, some information was withheld, particularly in places where this is happening, because these agencies may want to try a similar technique or use a similar tactic again without the enemy knowing necessarily all the details that go through it. But I think this was our approach, and again, it kind of mirrors the approach that we do on a day-to-day basis working as New York Times reporters.
And as far as the question about the NSA, General Alexander, who's dual-hatted as director of the NSA as well as commander of U.S. Cyber Command, gave us his very first interview ever. And as you know, Fort Meade is so highly classified that we couldn't even enter the Fort Meade complex. So we met at the National Cryptologic Museum, which is outside the gate. So I call it our first date, and I didn't even get off the front porch.
All right, thank you. There have been several television interviews, including a Fox affiliate in California, of spokespersons for an organization called the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. This is a group of about 1,600 licensed architects and engineers in the United States who are claiming that the evidence, scientific evidence that they've analyzed shows that the two towers and Building 7 were brought down by controlled demolition. Now, whether we believe this or not, this is what these licensed architects are putting their careers on the line for to say, and they want a new investigation. Do you think that Al-Qaeda could have had the capability on 9/11 to plant explosives in the buildings, which takes weeks to do? Would they have had that kind of capability?
No, they wouldn't have. I know this has come up. I was asked about it in a previous lecture just out on the West Coast last week, and I'm not familiar with exactly what these architects are saying, but I do know, that this was unprecedented to have these kind of attacks with basically aircraft full of jet fuel coming in and going through. And I think without, neither one of us are technical experts here on how this may have happened. I would have personal skepticism about this scenario, but I think a lot was not known about how this amount of jet fuel at the high temperature that it raised, basically forming a molten core in the middle. But I think we would refer you and refer others to the investigations that have taken place, and they have been exhaustive in looking at how exactly this could happen, because how two buildings side by side could actually implode like this, not keel over, tip over, but implode like that. Obviously, it was of great interest to the engineering community involved, and you can imagine the insurers as well, in looking at how this possibly could have happened, not just once, but twice.
We have just spent an hour listening to why this happened and how it happened and what this country and others are trying to do to keep it from happening again. We have sat through several other hours in the last couple of years of very similar forums. And I can go all the way back to Cain and Abel. But how can you get into the culture that creates people that want to go out and give their life to bomb? It's one thing to go out when your country has been attacked, as we have in defending World War II and those kinds of things. I don't know that there's an answer to this question, but how do we get along with people so they don't want to bomb us? And there's the latest thing now is why do they hate us so much?
Well, I think to unpack your question, how do we get into their culture? I think that's impossible. The sorts of changes that you're talking about have to happen internally within the Muslim world. Muslims themselves must decide that violent extremism carried out in the name of their great religion is something that they don't want to tolerate. Should the United States and other countries in the West help that part of the world to eradicate what Eric earlier described so well as the poverty of hope? Of course, that's our job, all of us, to help our fellow men and women, of course. But whenever you talk about us getting into their culture, how do we win their hearts and minds, I think Muslims find that very insulting, because to talk about winning their hearts and minds says to them, you have to love us and think like us. And we would not appreciate that coming from another culture. I think one of our interviews was with a 3-star general named Mark Hertling with multiple deployments in Iraq. And after he left Iraq for the 3rd time, he said he had gotten far beyond the military concept of hearts and minds. What this country should do is earn the respect and the trust of these countries. We can only do that by the way we behave.
We'll close with another question from Twitter, which comes from human rights activist Abdinir Hussein. He asks, will there be a backlash from the U.S. launching drones in the Horn of Africa, specifically in Ethiopia?
I think there's always that. I think there's always that possibility, as we've certainly seen in Pakistan, even as the CIA has become much more adept at its targeting, so that it lessens the impact on civilians, because they're very conscious of this and the notion that this could be counterproductive as they try and hunt down the terrorist leaders. Again, think of drones as a tactic, and this is a tactic that reflects a failure of a certain part of another policy. And whether it's in Pakistan or Yemen and Somalia, it means it's a means where this administration, the previous administration, have tried to build up the security forces of those countries so they can fight the fights on their territory, so the U.S. doesn't have to, with all the baggage that brings. But if you look at these examples, Pakistan, particularly this area of North Waziristan, that's basically a no-go zone, obviously not just for American troops, but even for Pakistani troops. They're not going after the militants in those areas for various reasons. If you look at Yemen now, the central government, even with the return of President Saleh, surprisingly over the weekend, is still collapsing largely. It's drawn in its American-trained counterterrorism forces to defend the capital, leaving vast spaces, even more spaces of Yemen for that al-Qaeda affiliate to hold on to. So again, there are no Yemeni troops out there trying to combat the forces. And in Somalia itself, there's a weak, virtually non-existent government in Mogadishu that's trying to hold off this Islamist group called Shabab. Well, again, this group has shown indications it has an international agenda to attack outside of its boundaries of Somalia. So the policy that this administration, following on the Bush administration, is if we can't get local allies, oftentimes undependable or unreliable allies, to go after this threat, to go after those groups that are specifically targeting the United States and American interests, then we, the United States government, has to do something about that. And one of the only tools at our disposal immediately are the drones. Now, we've talked about a wide range of other things, diplomacy, counterinsurgency. These things take time and a lot of effort and a lot of money, to be honest. And yes, those are probably better long-term solutions, but if you face a short-term problem in that there are imminent threats to this country, what do you do about it if those countries where these terrorists are living and working and operating, if those countries can't deal with it, the United States feels they have to go after it. And unfortunately, one of the few tools they have in the immediate is to go after with drones, airstrikes, those type of things. It's not the best solution.
Thank you both for a fascinating talk and for your excellent reporting.